Rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the limousine as it rolled to a stop in front of the gray concrete building. Alexander Rowan Kane, CEO of Ethon Industries, stepped out under the cover of a black umbrella held by his assistant. He was always composed. Always calculating. But today, something about him was different. His steps were hesitant, and his breath caught in his throat when he saw her standing just beyond the gate, holding the hand of a small child. The girl looked straight at him. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply whispered something to the child, who looked up at Alexander with wide, curious eyes. And that was when it happened. Alexander froze. The boy's face, it was unmistakable. The nose. The eyes. The small dimple on the left cheek. A mirror. A reflection of a past he thought had vanished forever. Alexander staggered a step back, eyes wide, lips parting without sound. He tried to speak but only managed a whisper. Who is he? The woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. The wind carried a piece of paper from the folder she clutched, a birth certificate. And on it, in clear print, under the name of the child, was one word that turned Alexander's world inside out. Father. He took a sharp breath. The walls of the world he had so meticulously built cracked beneath him. The stock market couldn't help him now. Nor could his army of lawyers, his global empire, or his legions of followers. None of it meant anything in the presence of this child, his child. The weight of years crashed upon him like the storm now soaking through his $1,000 suit. But he didn't care. He dropped to his knees in the mud, uncaring of the press, the cameras, or his legacy. He looked up at her, voice shaking. Please, let me call you my daughter. For a second, silence reigned. Even the rain seemed to hush. Her eyes, unreadable for a moment, flicked toward the child. Then she turned and walked away. The boy lingered, torn. Then, obediently, he followed. Alexander remained on his knees, soaked and shivering, as the gate clicked shut. 6 years ago. It began not with love, but with a transaction. A single moment in time when the lives of two people, so vastly different, collided like a spark in dry hay. A college girl with shadows behind her eyes. A billionaire trying to outrun his ghosts. Neither expected what came next. And neither would ever be the same again. Back then, she had walked into the world of power and privilege not as an equal, but as a placeholder. A proxy. A pawn. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. Because what Alexander Kane didn't know that night, when he looked at her across the polished marble lobby, when he extended the first contract, when he thought he was in control, was that she was not just a girl from nowhere. She was a girl who had never been given a choice. And now, standing before him, soaked in silence, she was no longer just a name on a contract. She was the woman who held his legacy in her arms. The child she never meant to raise alone. The moment dissolved into mist. A guard called out. Reporters murmured. And Alexander remained kneeling, broken not by scandal or failure, but by the realization that the one thing he tried to buy, had already walked away from him. She had given everything. And he, had given nothing. Until now. 6 years before that desperate moment at the mansion gate, before her trembling hands clutched the boy's backpack like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality, she was just another invisible girl in a world that never noticed when someone like her disappeared. At that time, Evelyn was 22, working double shifts at a crumbling downtown diner where the neon signs buzzed louder than the customers ever did. She lived in the back room of a hardware store her uncle let her use, sleeping between paint cans and stacks of unsold hammers. There was no mirror in that room, only a shard of broken glass taped to the wall, which showed a face that looked more tired each morning. She had never seen a real CEO in person. Only on headlines and stock updates that scrolled across the screen of the bar's tiny TV. Back then, Alexander Kane was already a myth, the golden man who never smiled, who built an empire from nothing but whose eyes, according to tabloids, had the weight of a man who'd lost something more than he could ever build. Evelyn had no idea that their worlds were set to collide, gently at first, like two ships brushing in fog before crashing through the ice. It started on a Thursday. Rain poured over the city like a punishment, and Evelyn was the last waitress on duty. The place was almost empty, except for a man sitting alone at the far end booth, his back to the window, hands folded on the table, a charcoal suit soaked dark at the cuffs. She didn't know who he was. Just another cold, tired stranger who didn't even glance at the menu. His silence didn't bother her. Most customers who looked like him didn't see her as anything more than a pair of hands and a receipt. But when she brought his black coffee, no cream, no sugar, he looked up. And something in her paused. Not because he was handsome, though he was. Not because he was rich, she didn't know that yet. But because his eyes didn't match his clothes. They weren't sharp or predatory like other men in suits. They were tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from work. But the kind that comes from losing something you never thought you'd have to lose. Rough day, she asked, because she didn't know what else to say, and also because she didn't expect him to answer. He didn't. Just stared at her for a second too long before saying, "You shouldn't work here." She blinked. "Sorry. You don't belong in places like this." He looked back at his coffee as if that explained everything. As if people like her had options. She smiled, politely, and turned to leave. But something made her pause again. "I don't belong anywhere," she said quietly. It wasn't meant to be heard, but it lingered in the air like steam over the coffee. He didn't look up this time, but his fingers tightened around the mug. She remembered that grip later, how it trembled just slightly, like a man holding onto the edge of something invisible. The next time she saw him, it was at the same booth, same day of the week. And then again. And again. He never gave his name. Never asked for hers. They never touched. They never flirted. But every Thursday night, for 6 weeks, he came in at the exact same time, and she brought him the same coffee. Sometimes they exchanged a few words. Sometimes they just sat in silence, him with his thoughts, her cleaning the counter, pretending not to glance his way every few minutes. And slowly, the way clouds open to light without anyone noticing, she began to feel seen. Until one night, he didn't show up. She waited longer than she should have, even past her shift. The rain had returned. She thought about stepping outside, just to look down the block, just in case. But she didn't. Because people like her didn't chase after men like him. The next week, he returned. No explanation. Just walked in like he had never been gone. But something had changed. He looked paler. Thinner. His eyes didn't meet hers this time. He ordered coffee. She brought it. He left without finishing. That night, she sat behind the diner with a cigarette she didn't light, because she didn't smoke. She just liked holding it. Made her feel like someone else, someone who had control over small things. That's when she found the envelope. Tucked beneath her jacket on the locker shelf. No name. No message. Inside was $500 in cash, and a note. Just 3 words. "You deserve more." She didn't cry. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't even spend it. But she folded the note carefully and hid it in the bottom of her worn-out sneaker. That was the last time she ever saw him. Or so she thought. Until 6 years later, on a morning that would change everything, her son looked up from his cereal and asked, "Mom, why does the man on TV have my eyes?" She froze. Because on the screen was Alexander Kane. And the boy had his jawline. His hair. His quiet. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked into the back room, pulled open the shoebox under her bed, and unfolded a crumpled note that she hadn't touched in years. "You deserve more." She stared at it for a long time. And whispered to no one, "Then why did you leave before I could choose?" She didn't know that soon, she'd see him again. But this time, it wouldn't be over coffee. It would be at the gates of a school. With their son between them. And everything they'd never said waiting like a storm behind their eyes. The apartment was no bigger than the back room she used to sleep in, but it was hers. Sort of. The peeling walls smelled of old paint and winter, and the heater rattled like an old man wheezing through a dream. But every inch of it had been scrubbed clean. Every corner held something Evelyn had fought for: second-hand toys, a fold-out table, a hand-stitched curtain to separate the kitchen from the bed. Nothing was perfect. But nothing had been given, either. She had earned every cracked tile, every light bulb that buzzed slightly off-key. And in the middle of it all, there was Ethan. He was 5 now. A quiet, curious boy who looked nothing like the world she came from, but everything like the man she never stopped thinking about. Sometimes, when he turned his head just so, the same shadow passed over his face, the one she remembered from that rainy Thursday, when Alexander Kane told her she didn't belong there. He had no idea then how right he was. And how wrong. Ethan didn't ask about his father often. He just watched other kids at the park and said things like, "Why do some dads wear ties?" Or, "If I had a dad, I'd want him to read the spaceship book." Evelyn always answered with a soft smile. "Maybe one day, you will." But she never told him the truth. Not because she was ashamed, but because some truths are too sharp for a child's heart. Because what could she say? That he was born from 6 weeks of silent coffees and 1 night of unsaid goodbye. That the man who held his DNA never even asked her name. No. Instead, she gave Ethan what she had, her time, her stories, her hands. She worked nights at a bakery, baking more than she could afford to eat, and early mornings at a laundromat, folding clothes that smelled like lives she would never live. Her hands were always tired, always dry, and always moving. She saved every dollar she could, hid it in a tin box labeled "Future," and every Sunday, she opened that box to count the bills and whisper to Ethan, "Someday, this will take us somewhere new." Sometimes he believed her. Sometimes she didn't believe herself. One day, he brought home a drawing from preschool. It showed a house with a sun on top, a tree that leaned to the left, and 3 stick figures. A woman with long hair. A boy. And a tall man with a square jaw and a crown. "Who's this?" Evelyn asked, tapping the figure with the crown. "That's Dad," Ethan said, matter-of-factly. "He's a king. But he's busy right now. He'll come find us when he's ready." She didn't cry. Not until he fell asleep. Then she lay on the floor beside his bed, looking at the drawing, whispering, "He's not a king, baby. But I hope to God you're right." What she didn't know was that her son's words weren't just wishful thinking. Somewhere across the city, in a glass tower that touched the clouds, Alexander Kane was staring at a photograph he didn't remember posing for. A woman's eyes haunted him, eyes that didn't belong in his world of contracts and conquest. He didn't know her name. But something about her face pulled at the only part of him he still hadn't sold off. Meanwhile, Evelyn's world kept moving, small, rhythmic, fragile. There was a grocery store down the block where she memorized the clearance patterns. The cashier there, Maria, gave her expired bread without charging. The old janitor in her building, Mr. Torres, kept a lookout for inspectors when her rent fell behind. Life wasn't kind. But it wasn't cruel either. It was indifferent. And sometimes, that felt worse. Still, Evelyn held on. She held on every time Ethan got a fever and she couldn't afford both medicine and groceries. She held on when she had to tell him, maybe next year, every time he asked for a bicycle. She held on when her boss at the bakery slapped her wrist for frosting the cakes too gently. "You're not here to feel, Evelyn," he said. "You're here to finish." She wanted to scream. But she didn't. Because if she lost this job, she'd lose the last thread holding her life together. And then, one Monday, the thread snapped. The bakery shut down. No warning. No severance. Just a sign taped to the glass, closed until further notice. Evelyn stared at her reflection in the door, wondering how a face could still look calm when the world inside it was breaking. She went home that day in silence. Ethan greeted her with a paper crown he made out of cereal box cardboard. "For you, Queen Mom," he said. "I saved you a cookie." She took it. She kissed his forehead. Then she locked herself in the bathroom and cried until the water ran cold. But the next morning, she got up. She dressed. She braided her hair. She took Ethan's hand and walked him to school like she always did. And as he ran off toward the gates, she waited, holding the strap of his backpack like it still carried her heart. That was the morning it happened. That was the moment a black car pulled up beside the school. The moment a man stepped out in a suit worth more than her apartment. The moment he glanced down at Ethan, really looked, and something in his face shattered. He knelt. He didn't speak. But when his eyes lifted to meet hers, Evelyn dropped the backpack. Because in that instant, she knew. He remembered. And everything she'd spent 6 years hiding was no longer hidden. Evelyn didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't even speak. For a long moment, she simply stood there on the sidewalk, frozen. Her fingers hovered just inches from the strap of the backpack she dropped, as if picking it up would somehow make this whole moment vanish. Alexander Kane was on one knee. Not in a gesture of romance. Not in power. Just, stunned. Like someone who had just been handed a puzzle with half the pieces already known and yet not fitting the way he remembered. Ethan, oblivious, skipped toward the school gate. "Bye, Mom," he shouted over his shoulder, waving to her with one hand and dragging the sleeve of his too-big jacket with the other. She nodded. That was all she could manage. Then Alexander rose slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something unfamiliar in his expression, an emotion she couldn't name, something between awe and guilt and a flicker of recognition that made her chest tighten. She finally whispered, "Why are you here?" He blinked, like her voice had broken a spell. I didn't know," he said, his voice low and ragged. "Until I saw him. I didn't even know I was looking." Evelyn crossed her arms without realizing it. Her posture changed. Back straight. Chin high. A reflex built from years of carrying shame like a second skin. But in that moment, she wasn't just Evelyn, the single mother who worked 2 jobs. She was the girl he'd left without asking her name. And she was the woman who had built a world in the silence he left behind. "You have no right to be here," she said, quiet but sharp. "He doesn't know who you are. And frankly, neither do I." Alexander looked like he wanted to speak. But the words got caught somewhere behind his expensive tie and the years of silence that separated them like an ocean. A school bell rang. Parents hurried past them, glancing curiously at the scene. But Evelyn didn't care. Not anymore. She picked up the backpack and turned away, not with rage, but with something colder. A hurt too tired to burn. She walked home with her heart in her throat and a ghost at her heels. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep with the blanket half off and his stuffed bear half under his chin, she sat on the floor with the tin box labeled "Future" in her lap. She opened it not to count the money, but to stare at the old photograph folded neatly at the bottom. It had been taken at the corner cafe near the university. 6 years ago. She had paid a classmate $5 to take it with a disposable camera because she wanted to remember that afternoon, the only afternoon he hadn't looked like the man everyone else saw. In that picture, Alexander Kane wasn't a CEO. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't untouchable. He was just Alex. Sitting across from her, laughing at the foam mustache the cappuccino left on her lip. She touched the corner of the photo, then folded it back again like she always did. She should have thrown it away years ago. She hadn't. Across the city, Alexander Kane stood in his penthouse office, surrounded by glass walls and silence. But his mind was miles away. On a child's face. On a woman's voice. On a rainy night he'd buried in a folder marked forget. He had spent the day asking his team for everything: camera footage from the school, names of recent contractors, even employee files from the catering service at last week's gala. All of it had felt ridiculous. Until he found one image, one frozen frame, one moment caught on tape: Evelyn, standing in the lobby, looking up at the chandelier like it might fall. He'd watched that frame for an hour. Then he remembered her eyes. And then the rest came crashing back. The alleyway. The storm. The girl with rain-slicked hair who told him, "I don't want your money. Just remember me when you can feel again." He hadn't remembered. Until today. And now that he had, the weight of it was unbearable. The next morning, Evelyn tried to pretend it hadn't happened. She packed Ethan's lunch with extra care, brushed his hair 3 times even though he squirmed, and kissed his forehead like nothing had changed. But inside, everything was shaking. At the grocery store, she thought she saw him. At the crosswalk, she swore it was his voice. She wasn't sure if she was afraid he'd show up again, or afraid he wouldn't. 3 days later, the letter came. Not a legal notice. Not a typed memo. It was handwritten. On thick paper with her name, just her first name, written in cursive that hadn't changed. Evelyn. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve answers. But I need to know if you ever looked back. If there's a world where we weren't strangers pretending we never touched. If I'm too late, I'll leave. But if I'm not, I'll wait. A. She stared at the letter long after the ink had dried. Then, she did something she hadn't done in years. She wrote back. Not a confession. Not a welcome. Just a single line, scrawled in trembling script. You said you'd remember me when you could feel again. Can you feel now? She didn't sign her name. But he'd know. And for the first time in 6 years, Evelyn closed the tin box not with fear, but with a tremor of something dangerously close to hope. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Evelyn stepped into the grand conference hall with hands pressed tightly against her sides, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres that had been arranged with such precision it felt like art. She was just a server tonight, part of a catering team hired for the annual charity gala of Kane Industries. It was supposed to be just another event. Just another shift. She should have known better the moment she read the name on the client contract. Alexander Kane. She had tried to switch shifts. She had begged the manager. But staffing was short, and it was a high-paying gig. And she needed every cent. So now she was here, standing under chandeliers shaped like frozen rain, walking between tuxedos and silk gowns, her shoes silent against the polished marble. She moved like a ghost, her face carefully blank, her eyes low. Until she saw him. He was across the room, speaking to a group of investors, his suit sharp, his posture effortless. There was laughter, polite nods, a gesture toward a presentation board. But Evelyn only saw the way his eyes kept flicking toward the hallway. He was waiting for something. Or someone. She didn't want to believe it was her. She turned her gaze away, clenching her jaw, trying to ground herself in the sound of clinking glasses and the distant hum of a string quartet. She passed by a cluster of guests, keeping her head down, trying not to breathe too deeply. And then someone stepped into her path. "I'll take one," a smooth voice said. Her hand reflexively extended the tray, until she looked up. It was him. Alexander. Their eyes met. And time splintered. Neither of them moved. Neither blinked. For a long, suspended second, the room disappeared. There were no guests. No music. No charity auction. Just the space between them, thick with everything unsaid. He reached for a canopy without looking, his fingers brushing hers. She flinched. He didn't let go. His eyes dropped to the red string around her wrist. His jaw clenched, almost imperceptibly, but his hand trembled slightly. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, voice low, calm, but not cold. "I didn't plan to be," she answered, equally steady. A pause. He gestured slightly toward a quiet corner. "Can we talk?" She shook her head before the sentence even finished. "I'm working. I'll wait." "That's not how this works," she whispered, stepping back. "You don't get to wait now." She turned and walked away. He didn't follow. But he watched her every step. Later that night, as the gala wound down and the last of the champagne glasses clinked to a close, Evelyn found herself in the staff room, undoing her apron, breathing like she'd just run a marathon. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know why seeing him again, truly seeing him, felt like stepping barefoot on a memory she'd buried in shards. There had been no confrontation. No screaming. No accusations. Just silence. And that silence hurt more than any word. She pulled out her phone, instinctively scrolling through her gallery, not for photos, but for that message she had never deleted. The one she had written to herself after Ethan was born. "He doesn't need a father who left. He needs a mother who stayed." It used to comfort her. Now it just made her feel tired. Across the city, Alexander stood alone on the rooftop of the Kane building, tie loosened, eyes cast toward the skyline. "She was here," he said to no one. 6 years later. She was here. His assistant had tried to ask why he looked so shaken earlier, why he had left the party early, why he didn't speak during the closing speech. But Alexander hadn't answered. Because how could he explain the way her eyes had landed on him like a storm held in silence? How could he say that everything, the years, the deals, the success, had meant so little the moment he saw that red string on her wrist? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something he hadn't touched in years. A note. Crumpled. Worn. Still faintly smelling of rain. "Don't remember my name. Just remember that someone once saw through you, and chose to stay." He had never known who left it. Not really. But now, he did. The next day, Evelyn returned to her usual job at the bakery. Morning light spilled through the windows, warm and golden, washing over the countertop as she helped an elderly man pick out a loaf of sourdough. When the bell above the door chimed, she didn't look up. Not until the silence lingered too long. She turned, and froze again. Alexander Kane stood in the middle of the bakery, holding a box of chocolate croissants. He looked out of place. Too sharp. Too expensive. Too him. But his voice was soft when he spoke. "I don't know your favorite flower. I don't know your favorite song. I don't even know what your middle name is." She said nothing. "But I want to." She opened her mouth, to stop him, maybe, to ask him to leave, but no sound came. So he walked forward and placed the box on the counter. "For the boy who looked exactly like me." And then he left. Evelyn stood there, breath caught in her chest, as if the air had just been rearranged by his presence. She looked down at the box. Taped to the top was a note, scribbled in the same handwriting from 6 years ago. "If I could do it again, I'd stay." She closed her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone in the room. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, a rare calm in the center of a city that never stopped moving. The rain had just let up, and its scent still clung to the window panes like breath on glass. Evelyn wiped down a table, her movements slow, distracted. Every now and then, her eyes flicked toward the counter, where the bakery box still sat, untouched since that morning. She hadn't opened it yet. Couldn't. Not when her hands still remembered the brush of his fingers. Not when her chest still trembled from the sound of his voice. So she worked. Silently. Rigidly. Like a ghost retracing the motions of a life she no longer recognized. But fate, as always, had its own timing. The door swung open with a jingle, and before she could even turn, she knew it was him. Alexander stepped inside, not as a CEO, not as the man who once held empires in the palm of his hand, but simply as a man who no longer had the answers. His coat was damp from the rain. His eyes were tired. And in his hands, he held a small plastic dinosaur. Evelyn stared. He glanced at the toy, then back at her, almost sheepish. "It's for Ethan," he said quietly. "You mentioned once he liked dinosaurs. I think. Or maybe I imagined it." She didn't answer. He didn't move any closer. "I don't expect you to say anything," he continued, his voice soft and deliberate. "I just needed to see you again. Needed to know if I'd already lost the only chance I ever had at something real." The silence that followed was heavy, thicker than the storm outside. Evelyn finally spoke, her tone clipped, trembling only at the edges. "You didn't lose it. You gave it away." He flinched. Not visibly. But she saw it. In the way his fingers tightened around the plastic toy. In the way his jaw clenched, like he was trying to swallow years of regret. "I didn't remember," he said, almost in a whisper. "Not until I saw the string on your wrist. And then, it came flooding back. That night. That promise. You made a lot of promises that night," she said, her smile brittle. "Only one of us had to live with them." He nodded slowly. "I know." Another pause. She looked away, toward the table she'd just cleaned. "Why now, Alexander? Why show up here? Why, any of this?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer and pulled something from his coat pocket. A folded piece of paper. She recognized at the moment she saw the corner. It was the sketch. The one Ethan had drawn. The one she thought she'd lost. He unfolded it carefully and laid it on the counter. There, in the scribbled lines of a child's hand, was a man holding hands with a small boy. Above them, written in blocky, uneven letters, were the words, "Maybe one day." Her hand flew to her mouth. "How did you?" "It fell out of the box when I opened it," he said. "I wasn't supposed to see it, was I?" She couldn't speak. Could barely breathe. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he continued. "I came to ask if there's still something inside you, anything, that remembers how it felt before everything fell apart." She closed her eyes. And in the dark, she did remember. She remembered the warmth of his coat as they shared it under the rain. The way he held her wrist, gently tying the red string and calling it a promise band. The way he had whispered, "If we survive this night, I'll never forget you." But he had. Or so she thought. She opened her eyes again and met his gaze. For the first time, he wasn't trying to charm her, or fix anything, or explain away the past. He was just there. Present. Raw. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted. "I don't even know who you are anymore." "That's fair," he said. "But maybe we could start there. You figuring out who I am now. And me, finally learning who you've become." Silence again. But this time, it wasn't sharp. It was tentative. Hopeful. A little boy's voice suddenly cut through it all from the back of the cafe. "Mom." Ethan came barreling into view, arms full of colored pencils, cheeks flushed. He stopped dead when he saw the man standing across from her. His eyes widened. He didn't speak. But his grip on the pencils tightened. Alexander crouched slowly, not too close. "Hey," he said, holding out the little dinosaur. "I got this for you. If you like it." Ethan stared at him for a long beat. Then he took the toy without a word, and hugged it to his chest. Alexander blinked hard. Evelyn watched the entire exchange with a heart that felt far too fragile for her chest. The man who had once been just a name on a birth certificate, was now a presence. Maybe not a father yet. But something. Something more than nothing. She didn't smile. But she didn't tell him to leave, either. As the rain began again outside, gentle this time, Alexander looked up at her and said quietly, "I'm not asking to rewrite the past. I'm just asking, to be a part of what comes next." She looked at her son. Then back at the man she once thought she'd never see again. And though her lips didn't move, her silence said it all. Maybe. Just maybe. The story wasn't over yet. It had been 3 days since that encounter at the cafe, and Alexander hadn't slept properly since. He paced through his penthouse like a man under siege, not by an enemy, but by time. Memories invaded his every step. Words he hadn't meant to forget returned in whispers. And that red string on her wrist, it haunted him. The same thread he had once tied with trembling fingers, thinking it was a silly promise made beneath the rain. But now he knew, that promise had been her lifeline. And he had let it rot in silence. He stood before a box he hadn't touched in years, shoved in the back of a locked closet. Inside, amidst old photos, forgotten cufflinks, and a journal he'd once vowed to fill daily, was a single Polaroid. The edges were curled. The ink faded. But the image was unmistakable. A younger Evelyn. Standing at the edge of the pier. Hair damp, holding a to-go coffee cup with both hands, the city's lights blurring behind her. And next to her, half-shadowed but smiling in a way he hadn't in decades, himself. Alexander Kane. He didn't even remember someone taking the picture. He picked up the Polaroid and something shifted in his chest. A pulse. A crack in the concrete he'd poured over every version of himself that dared feel. "I promised I'd come back," he murmured to the photograph, as if it could speak. "But I never did I?" That night, he called Lorne, his most trusted driver, the one who'd worked with him before the mergers, before the IPO, before he became Mr. Kane. "Do you remember the night I left that gala early?" Alexander asked. Lorne was quiet on the line. "Then, the night you said you had to go find someone. And didn't come back for 2 days." "Yeah. I remember." Alexander clenched his jaw. "Where did I go?" "I don't know, sir," Lorne replied. "But you came back with your shirt torn and a different look in your eyes. You didn't talk to anyone for a week." He hung up and sat in the dark for hours, staring at the photograph, tracing the outline of Evelyn's smile. The next morning, he didn't go to the office. Instead, he walked into an old storage unit he'd leased under a fake name, his secret escape back when the boardroom felt more like a cage than a throne. He sifted through boxes of sketches, business plans, and personal journals. Then he found it. A napkin. Stained and wrinkled. On it, scribbled in his handwriting, were the words, "If you ever feel lost, follow the red thread. I'll be on the other end." He gasped. The red thread. She had worn it for 6 years. Never taken it off. He drove, fast, reckless, until he reached the park where they'd first met. It was pouring again. Of course it was. The city seemed to remember what he had forgotten. He stood beneath the same crooked street lamp where he had once offered her shelter. The smell of damp pavement, jasmine from the nearby garden, the sound of distant sirens, it all came back. And suddenly, he wasn't 50-year-old Alexander Kane, empire builder. He was just a boy who fell in love and forgot to return. When he got back home, he found Ethan's drawing again, the one with the faceless man in a suit. Only now, it wasn't faceless. Not to him. It was a mirror. One that stared straight into his failure. He needed to know more. He needed to remember everything. And someone, he thought, did remember. Mrs. Lindholm. She had worked in accounting for over 2 decades. Retired now, but she had always been a quiet observer of everything that went on behind the scenes, especially the few times Alexander had arrived to work late, disheveled, looking like a storm had passed through him. He visited her the next day. She opened the door with surprise. "Mr. Kane. I need to ask about someone," he said, no longer formal. "A woman I met 6 years ago." Mrs. Lindholm's eyes narrowed just slightly, as if a distant bell had rung. "The girl in the red dress," she said. His breath caught. "You came back from that night a ghost," she continued. "You stared at your phone like it was going to bring her back. Then you stopped coming in altogether for a while. Why didn't anyone say anything?" He whispered. "Because you never let anyone close," she said. "But that night, you changed. And the change scared you." He left her house shaken. Later that night, he sat in front of his fireplace, the sketch of Ethan in one hand, and the Polaroid in the other. Then, like a dam bursting, it hit him. That night, they'd talked about children. She had laughed when he said he never wanted a family. She had said, "You're afraid to love something that might walk away." And he had replied, "I'm afraid to love something I might destroy." Tears sprang to his eyes. He had destroyed it. Every ounce of it. Until now. The next morning, he arrived at the cafe again. Evelyn was there. She froze when she saw him, hand halfway to a tray of pastries. "I remembered," he said simply. "All of it." She didn't speak. He held up the Polaroid. The night on the pier. The napkin. The promise. Your laugh. The way you held the world like it never gave you anything, but you still gave back. I remember it all. Evelyn's throat worked to swallow her silence. He stepped closer, his voice cracking. "I broke the thread. But you kept holding on." Still, she said nothing. He nodded slowly, then placed the Polaroid on the counter. "I'm not asking you to pick it up," he said. "Just know it exists. Just know you exist, in every part of me I thought had died." He turned to leave. But then Ethan appeared, sneakers squeaking on the floor, hair a mess of curls, a crayon in one hand. "Mom," he said quietly, tugging her apron. "Why's he sad?" She looked down at her son, and her chest shuddered. "Because," she whispered, "sometimes grown-ups forget what matters most." And as she said it, she finally looked up, and didn't look away. She met Alexander's eyes. And he knew. The mask had cracked. One layer had peeled away. But the truth? The truth would burn next. The wind picked up that morning, rushing through the narrow streets like a whisper laced with urgency. Alexander didn't sleep. He had sat in his car all night across the street from the cafe, watching the windows light up one by one as dawn painted the horizon. He didn't know what he was waiting for. A sign? A signal? Forgiveness? When the door opened and Evelyn stepped outside with a tray of discarded pastries, he didn't move. He just watched. She didn't see him. Or maybe she did. But she didn't look. At 8:03 a.m., the moment came. Ethan burst through the door, dragging his backpack behind him, one shoe untied, his shirt crooked. He stopped just short of the sidewalk, looked both ways, then spotted Alexander's car. And smiled. The boy jogged over like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Are you back?" he asked, resting his chin on the half-open window. Alexander blinked. Ethan continued. "Mom said sometimes people get lost. But they come back when they remember." He tried to smile, but it came out broken. "I remember," Alexander said softly. "But I don't know if that's enough." Ethan furrowed his brow. "It's a start." That's when Evelyn appeared at the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other clutching the edge of her apron. Her face was unreadable. Not anger. Not fear. Not softness, either. Just exhaustion. The kind of weariness that grows roots in a person when they've waited too long for an answer that never came. "I need to speak to you," Alexander said, stepping out of the car, the cool morning air hitting his skin like judgment. She didn't stop him, but she didn't invite him either. Inside the cafe, he sat across from her at a table in the corner, the same one he used to pick out from the window whenever he drove by but never had the courage to enter. Ethan drew spaceships on a napkin nearby, oblivious to the quake about to rupture the world. Alexander began. "I didn't remember everything at once. It came in pieces. A photograph. A voice. A scent in the air. And then, the red string. You never took it off." Evelyn looked down at her wrist. It was there, frayed, faded, but still tied. Still clinging. "I didn't wear it for you," she whispered. "I wore it to remind myself not to forget who I was. Before all of this." He nodded. "I understand now." She exhaled, her voice tight. "No. You don't." Her hand moved into her bag. She pulled out a sealed envelope and slid it across the table. He stared at it. "Open it," she said. His fingers trembled as he tore the seal. Inside was a document. A paternity test. And a photo. It was him. Younger. Eyes softened by something rare. And Evelyn, cheeks flushed with wind and happiness, leaning into him under the glow of a city street lamp. And then the name, Ethan Lancaster, came. He didn't breathe for a full 10 seconds. His lips parted. A word tried to form. But there was none. "I wasn't going to tell you," she said, arms crossed, pain tight in her jaw. "Not after the way you left. Not after what that night did to me." He swallowed hard, unable to lift his gaze from the paper. "I didn't know," he whispered. "You never called. Never came back. I waited 2 months. Then 4. Then I stopped counting. I forgot," he said, ashamed. "I was drunk? Busy? Important?" she snapped. "No," he said, louder now. "I was scared. And that stopped her." He continued, voice low, pleading. "Scared that what I felt was real. That if I let you in, I'd lose control. And control is all I've ever had. You left me with a child," she said. "I raised him alone. While you sat in penthouses, I worked 3 jobs. I slept on buses, skipped meals, smiled when he asked if Daddy was coming home. I didn't have the luxury of forgetting." Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall. "I didn't want your money. I wanted your presence." He stood. Slowly. Then knelt beside her chair, not for theatrics, but because he no longer felt worthy to speak from above. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said. "But I will ask for a chance to earn it." She looked at him. For the first time, truly looked. No hatred. No venom. Only the ashes of love, still warm. "I told myself, if he ever came back," she said, "I'd ask just one thing." "What is it?" he asked, barely breathing. She touched the red string. Twisted it once. "Was I just a transaction to you? A fling? A girl you used for warmth and forgot?" His voice cracked. "No. You were the only real thing I ever had." The cafe was silent. Ethan looked up from his drawing. He saw his mother's face soften, then harden again. She nodded slowly. "Then prove it." He blinked. "How?" "Be a father. Be present. Not because it's the right thing. But because it's the only thing you'll have left when everything else fades." He stood, chest tight, eyes wet. "Will you let me?" he asked, voice trembling. She hesitated. Then Ethan walked over. Held his hand out to Alexander. "Do you want to see my spaceship?" Alexander knelt again. And took it. Not the spaceship. The chance. A heartbeat later, Evelyn whispered. "One step. Just one." And in that moment, Alexander Kane, the man who once controlled empires, took the first real step of his life. But he didn't know yet that the real test had only just begun. If Banda San Song, Nan, Viet Teep Fan 9, Noi Su Chuak Loi Bat Dao, and Hong Kong Ai Chikasi Ko Emotiket Tuk Ko Hao. The sky over the city was gray, not the angry kind of gray that brought storms, but the kind that pressed quietly against your chest, like the weight of memories you never meant to carry this long. Alexander Kane sat in the back of his town car, unmoving, the world outside passing in slow motion. His driver had asked 3 times if he wanted to go home. Each time, he shook his head. Because the truth was, he no longer knew where home was. The photograph Evelyn had given him burned in his coat pocket. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her eyes, hardened by disappointment, shadowed by exhaustion. But it was Ethan's face that haunted him the most. That smile. That tilt of the head. That innocent voice asking if he wanted to see a spaceship. Alexander had conquered markets, bought out rivals, built towers with his name etched in gold. But none of it prepared him for the realization that he'd missed the most human experience of all. Fatherhood. He told his driver to stop at a small florist on the east side. The shop smelled of soil and memory. He didn't know what he was looking for, roses seemed too cliché, orchids too formal. In the end, he chose a sunflower. Bright. Simple. The kind of flower Ethan might like. When he arrived at Evelyn's apartment, he hesitated at the door. It wasn't fear of rejection that stopped him. It was the knowledge that he deserved it. But he knocked anyway. No answer. A neighbor opened their door across the hall. "She's not there," the old woman said, rubbing her arms. "She left this morning. With the boy. Looked like she had a destination this time." He thanked her, numb, and turned away. Back in the car, he didn't give an address. He just let the vehicle roll through the city, past places he used to love, past buildings he once dreamed of owning, past playgrounds where fathers pushed their children on swings. He watched them like a stranger, like a man on the outside of a life he could have had. By dusk, he found himself at the cemetery gates. It was instinct. The grave Evelyn had always visited with Ethan wasn't hard to find. It was humble. The stone read only, Amelia Rose Callahan, beloved daughter. Gone too soon. He remembered that name. Vaguely. From a file. A college girl who died in an accident. No one had ever told him Evelyn's sister was Amelia. He knelt down. "I never asked who she cried for," he whispered to the ground. "I just assumed it wasn't my business." The wind carried the scent of jasmine and wet leaves. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. "I'm sorry," he said. "To both of you." That night, he didn't go back to the penthouse. He slept in the car. When his assistant called at sunrise, he answered with a voice that barely sounded like his own. "Cancel the board meeting. Push the investor dinner." "But sir." "Tell them I'm done pretending this company is my whole life. Because it's not. Not anymore." He hung up before she could answer. At noon, he found himself standing in the kitchen of a bakery Evelyn once worked at. The owner remembered her. Kind girl. Quiet. Protective of that boy like he was gold. "She is gold," Alexander murmured. The woman handed him a slip of paper. A forwarding address. Just a town name. Willow Creek. She said she needed a fresh start. He didn't wait. Packed a small bag. Left instructions for his company to run without him. And drove. No entourage. No bodyguards. Just a man and a mission. By the time he reached Willow Creek, it was raining. Again. Like it had that night 6 years ago. He walked the main street slowly, peering into cafes, bookshops, laundromats. Then he saw it. A school. Children filing out with backpacks bouncing. And near the back of the line, a boy in a red hoodie, jumping over puddles. His heart stopped. Then Ethan saw him. And waved. No hesitation. No fear. Just joy. Alexander rushed forward, but stopped when he saw Evelyn standing just a few feet away. She looked different. Peaceful. But not relaxed. Like someone who still carried too much but had learned to walk with it. "You found us," she said. "I told you I would." He stepped closer. Then held out the sunflower, now slightly wilted from the drive. "I don't know what comes next," he said. "I'm not asking for permission to fix the past. I just want the chance to not waste the future." She didn't reach for the flower. But she didn't step back either. Ethan ran between them, grabbed his mother's hand, and tugged at Alexander's sleeve. "Can he come with us, Mom?" Evelyn looked down at her son, then up at the man she once loved. Maybe still did. Maybe not. But there was a flicker in her eyes. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something gentler. Possibility. She nodded once. "Come on," she said. "The bakery here sells the worst coffee. But Ethan insists it's magical." Alexander smiled. "I could use a little magic." And as they walked down the rainy street, 3 silhouettes under a sky that was finally learning to weep and let go, he realized this wasn't a second chance. It was the first real one he'd ever had. New banda san sang, nan, viet teep fan ten, noi emotiban te duok nam lai kong chi la the Thursday, ma la loi hua si kong de mat now them emoti la now nua. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, casting speckled gold across the quiet streets of Willow Creek. It wasn't the kind of town that made headlines, no skyscrapers, no CEOs, no paparazzi. Just clean air, creaking porches, and the soft laughter of children skipping down cracked sidewalks. And it was here, in this quiet simplicity, that Alexander Kane, once a man of billion-dollar deals and hardened walls, found himself walking slower than ever before. Not because he was tired, but because, for the first time in years, he didn't want to miss a thing. He watched Evelyn from across the park, sitting on a wooden bench beneath a willow tree, reading to Ethan. Her hair blew gently in the breeze, and her voice rose and fell like a lullaby lost in time. The boy leaned on her shoulder, one shoe untied, cheeks still rosy from running. They looked like a painting. A life he never thought he'd be allowed to step into. A door that had been shut for too long. He stayed back. He didn't want to startle them. He just needed to see it with his own eyes. Then Ethan looked up. As if pulled by invisible thread, the boy's gaze found him. Alexander froze. Ethan stood, handed the book back to his mother, and started walking. Not running. Not shouting. Just walking. Steady. Calm. Like he knew something his parents were still afraid to say out loud. "Hi again," the boy said when he reached him. Alexander bent to one knee. "Hi, Ethan." Ethan looked at him closely. "You came back." "I did. For me. For you. And for her. And for the person I should have been a long time ago." Ethan tilted his head. "You look sad." "I am," Alexander said. "But I'm trying not to be. Because seeing you makes me want to be better." The boy nodded slowly. "Do you want to come sit with us?" "I'd like that very much." They walked back together, Ethan holding his hand loosely, not tightly, but enough. Enough to make Alexander feel something crack open inside. When they reached the bench, Evelyn looked up, startled at first, but didn't move. Her eyes met Alexander's, and for a moment, neither of them blinked. "I didn't want to interrupt," he said softly. "You didn't. Can I sit?" She hesitated. Then nodded. "There's space." He lowered himself onto the other end of the bench, careful not to get too close. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick, yes. But not hostile. Like two people who had survived the same storm, and now sat in the wreckage, unsure whether to rebuild, or simply rest. "Thank you," he finally said. "For what?" "For raising him. For being stronger than I was. For still being here." "I wasn't," she said. "Not really. I left the moment you forgot me. I just kept moving, because he needed someone who wouldn't." "I remember now," he whispered. "All of it. The rain. Your laugh. The way you held my hand when you thought I was asleep. I remember everything." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I didn't come here for you to remember. I know. But I want you to know that I do." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered card. The one Ethan had drawn. The man with no face. The little boy holding his hand. "I saw this," he said, his voice cracking. "And I realized. I've been that man my whole life. No face. No soul anyone could see. Just money. Status. Control. But this card made me want a face again. If not for the world, then at least for you too." She looked down at the card, fingers trembling slightly. Then Ethan climbed into her lap, curling against her. "Is he gonna stay, Mommy?" She looked at Alexander. He didn't beg. Didn't plead. He just waited. Quiet. Open. Real. "I don't know," she said. "But maybe, we let today be today." He nodded. "That's enough for me." The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the sound of children playing nearby, of leaves brushing against each other like soft-spoken promises. Alexander reached down and plucked a tiny clover from the grass, spinning it between his fingers. "You know," he said, half smiling, "I once thought success was about building things higher than anyone else. But maybe it's really just about staying still long enough, to be found." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached over, slow, unsure, and placed her hand atop his. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a beginning or an end. It was a choice. A word she had never been allowed to own. And now, for the first time, it was hers. The bench beneath them creaked as the sun slipped behind the trees. And in that quiet, in that warmth, a billionaire who once bought everything learned what it meant to earn something. Not with power. But with patience. Not with money. But with presence. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Kane didn't feel like a man trying to win something back. He felt like a father. He felt like a man who stayed.